What happens when a prejudiced neighbor spends months judging a family she believes doesn't belong, only to discover they are the very people who could have transformed her community? This is the story of one woman's shocking wake-up call, and the family who responded with grace, proving that true worth isn't defined by the color of your skin. In a quiet, middle-class suburban neighborhood, where everyone knew everyone's business, Judy Thompson prided herself on being the backbone of the community. A longtime resident, she had seen the neighborhood grow, yet she believed it should remain the same, a place of safety, tradition, and conformity. So when the Johnson family, a black family, moved into the house across the street, Judy couldn't help but feel unsettled. The house was well kept, but to her, the new neighbors represented a shift she wasn't ready to embrace. Judy, a woman in her early 50s with short, frosted hair and a stern expression, wasted no time in forming her opinions. She'd often make pointed remarks when chatting with other neighbors about the Johnsons. "They're not like us," she'd whisper, her voice laced with judgment. "I bet they're just here for a quick fix. I don't trust people who move in like that." She criticized the family's style of living, claiming their cars were too flashy for the neighborhood and that their kids were too loud. She saw them as an invasion, unwelcome and out of place in her perfect, pristine world. She even commented on their backyard barbecue, calling it unsophisticated, as if their enjoyment of life was beneath her. Judy felt justified in her disdain, believing her opinions were the ones that mattered, as if her long tenure in the neighborhood gave her a voice that overshadowed everyone else's. The Johnson family had always dreamed of owning a home in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. After years of hard work, sacrifice, and persistence, they finally found their place, a charming house in the quiet, tree-lined street where they hoped to build a future for their two children, Ella and Malik. Monique, the mother, was a lawyer, while her husband David worked as an executive at a tech firm. Both were educated professionals with a deep sense of pride in their work. They kept a low profile, focused on their jobs, and prioritized their children's well-being above all else. Their goal was simple: to give Ella and Malik a life filled with opportunities, surrounded by good schools and kind neighbors. But settling into their new home wasn't as seamless as they'd hoped. Despite their efforts to blend in, they were met with cold stares and subtle, often unspoken discrimination. At the local grocery store, the clerk would double-check their payment method, as if doubting its validity. At neighborhood events, Monique and David were often left out of conversations or given curt responses when they tried to introduce themselves. The children, eager to make friends, were frequently ignored or spoken to with forced politeness, as if they were intruders in a place that wasn't meant for them. The Johnsons never let these slights show. They knew their worth, and despite the challenges, they remained determined to create a welcoming home for their family. But in a neighborhood that seemed to value conformity, fitting in was harder than they imagined. Judy Thompson wasted no time in launching her campaign against the Johnson family. Every chance she got, she whispered to her neighbors about the trouble she believed the new family would bring. "They just don't fit in here," she'd murmur, her voice low but insistent. "They're different, and you know what that means." To Judy, their mere presence was an intrusion, and she made it clear she wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. She started with subtle complaints. She told anyone who would listen that the Johnsons' kids were too loud, their laughter disrupting the peaceful, quiet atmosphere that Judy had come to expect. She claimed their yard was messy, despite it being well-maintained, and that their cars were too flashy for the neighborhood, making it feel unsafe. The details didn't matter to Judy, only that she could sow doubt in others' minds. When whispers didn't seem to be enough, Judy escalated. She reported the Johnsons to the neighborhood association, citing vague complaints of noise and disorder. She emphasized how the family's lifestyle didn't seem to fit the neighborhood's standards. Soon, the other neighbors began to distance themselves from the Johnsons. Invitations to barbecues and neighborhood gatherings became scarce. Conversations became shorter when the Johnsons walked by, and people began to cross the street to avoid them. The subtle, yet effective, campaign led by Judy had taken root, and the Johnson family, who had hoped for inclusion, now found themselves isolated and unwelcome. Judy's campaign against the Johnsons continued unchecked. She spread rumors, lodged complaints, and fueled the growing suspicion that the family didn't belong. As weeks passed, the neighborhood became colder toward the Johnsons, but Judy felt vindicated. She thought she had everyone's support, and that made her even more determined to push them out. Little did she know, she was about to be shocked by a revelation that would turn everything upside down. The twist came at the neighborhood's annual charity gala. The event, usually a low-key gathering for the local residents, was to be held at the community center. Judy, always involved in organizing such events, had spent weeks preparing for it. She expected another night of mingling with familiar faces, until the Johnsons arrived. As Monique and David walked into the venue, the atmosphere shifted. There was an audible gasp from some guests, followed by hushed whispers. Judy stood frozen, her eyes widening in disbelief. The Johnsons weren't just another family in the neighborhood. They were major benefactors of the charity, with ties to several influential organizations. Monique, it turned out, was the chairwoman of a prominent legal foundation, and David was a major investor in local businesses, known for funding education initiatives. The realization hit hard. The Johnsons were wealthy, highly respected, and deeply involved in the community, everything Judy had assumed they weren't. As people around her began to approach the Johnsons with respect and admiration, Judy's face reddened, and the weight of her prejudices came crashing down. She had misjudged them, and now, there was no denying it. Judy stood in stunned silence as she watched the Johnsons, once the subject of her disparaging remarks, engage with the other guests. She had spent weeks spreading rumors about them, convinced they didn't belong in the neighborhood. Now, standing in the middle of the charity gala, she realized how deeply she had misjudged them. The Johnsons weren't just ordinary newcomers, they were pillars of the community, leaders and benefactors, whose contributions were immeasurable. Her stomach churned with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. How had she not known? How could she have so easily dismissed them based on their skin color and background? Her face flushed with shame as she overheard conversations praising the Johnsons for their philanthropic work. "I didn't know they were such big supporters," one neighbor whispered. Judy felt a knot tighten in her chest. She replayed all the things she'd said. The complaints about their cars, the judgments about their children, the insinuations that they didn't belong. It all seemed so petty now, so small, compared to who they really were. The realization stung. The Johnsons had always been more than she had given them credit for, far more than the assumptions she had made, based on nothing but her own prejudice. A wave of guilt washed over Judy. She had alienated them when she could have embraced them as neighbors, even friends. In that moment, her own ignorance was painfully clear, and she couldn't shake the crushing regret for her actions. Judy's shame weighed heavily on her as she stood at the edge of the gala, watching the Johnsons surrounded by neighbors who now treated them with the respect they had always deserved. She knew that the damage was done, that her words, her actions, had already caused harm. With a deep breath, Judy walked over to the Johnsons, her steps slow, each one filled with hesitation. She had to apologize. "Monique, David," she began, her voice shaky, "I owe you both an apology. I judged you unfairly. I said things I shouldn't have." Her face was flushed with regret, her words stumbling out in a rush. "I'm sorry. I was wrong." Monique and David exchanged a glance, and then Monique spoke with quiet grace. "Thank you, Judy. That means a lot," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was no anger behind it, only a quiet strength. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we move forward." The words stung Judy, not out of bitterness, but because of the humility and kindness the Johnsons showed her. They didn't hold her prejudice against her. Instead, they chose to rise above it, embodying the very dignity she had denied them. As the night wore on, Judy found herself reflecting on the weight of her actions. She had confronted her ignorance, but the path to change was not going to be easy. The question now was whether she would truly learn from this moment and work to change her mindset, or if the isolation she felt from the rest of the neighborhood would be her true consequence.